Today we're going to go over Vaush's reaction video to Sam Harris's podcast about the riots and Black Lives Matter and police brutality for two reasons. I like Sam Harris. I love his content, and I believe he does a great service to our public discourse. I enjoy some of Vaush's content as well. I obviously don't agree with everything both of the men say completely. That's a given. Most people don't agree with everything other people say. But I think that Vaush messed up on this one pretty bad. One, if you're going to go over something like this in a video, you should take the time to listen to the whole podcast. I understand it's two hours long. Perhaps Vaush could have broken his reaction up like I'm going to do here, because Vaush's video is like 40 minutes. So I'm going to do a part 1 today, and then I will release a part 2 going over the second half of Vaush's reaction video. Vaush should have done the same thing, because there's a lot that Sam says before this part that Vaush goes over that, given the context, Vaush probably would have said or addressed it differently. But he didn't do that.
Whole video from start to finish, skipping ad segments and what have you, title cards. And for that reason, it is essentially impossible for me to make shit up about what my opponent is saying. I can't take them out of context. I can't strawman them because they're right there. I'm directly responding. Unfortunately, this extremely popular episode of Sam Harris's podcast, Making Sense with Sam Harris, nearly 600,000 views, is nearly 2 hours long. That is a very, very long segment. It's a podcast. I can't respond to the entirety of this video. It's not possible. But I know that this segment contains stuff that I would disagree with severely. I had somebody email me, and they provided me a timestamp they suggested I begin watching from. It's entirely possible I will be missing out on some context here. And because it is possible that I'm going to miss out on some context, I'm going to make an effort to be as charitable as possible to the arguments that I hear, even though I generally have a very low opinion of Sam Harris, because I don't want to run the risk of assuming things that he has made caveats for beforehand. Let's begin.
Right, we're talking about career criminals who are usually armed and in many cases trying to kill the cops. Those aren't the cases we're worried about. We're worried about the unjustified homicides. Now, some people will think these numbers still represent an outrageous injustice.
So we're opening up by talking about black deaths at the hands of police. Now, it is true there are shootouts with cops committed by black men, and I would make the argument that while anyone who opened fires on a cop probably has license to be killed, I think that's reasonable to say. I wouldn't blame a cop for firing back. I also believe the fact that there is so much conflict in these communities speaks to certain forms of discrimination in and of itself.
After all, African Americans are only 13% of the population. So at most, they should be 13% of the victims of police violence, not 25%. And any departure from the baseline population must be due to racism. Okay, well, that sounds plausible, but consider a few more facts.
Well, it's reductive right there. So I know what Sam Harris is about to say, and this is why I don't pre-watch these things live, because I can't do my Joseph Joestar, I know what you're about to say bullshit if I actually do know what they're about to say. And the response that I'm about to make preemptively is this. It is true that there are a bunch of correlating factors that go into the oppression of black people, i.e., if you control for socioeconomic circumstance, so on and so forth. The issue is, as with every other disparity in our society, there are only two potential causes: environment or genetics. If you want to make the genetics argument that black people are just predisposed towards committing crime inherently, I invite you to present me data on that subject. I know for a fact that there is none. But if you agree there are environmental causes, then it is very easy to trace those environmental causes back to things which linger from obvious and deliberate on-the-books racism, not even to speak of the implicit racism in our society today.
Facts.
Okay, so far I really don't have a single gripe with what is said, except for the funny part where he would make the argument that it's okay for a cop to fire back at someone who's shooting at them. Yeah, duh. Like, I think everyone is cool with that. Sam mentions 13% of the population, but in actuality, it's actually less than that because it's mainly black men. So it's probably around, let's just cut it in half, 6.5, 7.5% of the population is contributing roughly 50% of the murders. That in and of itself is a staggering point of subject then that we can't ignore.
Blacks are 13% of the population, but they commit at least 50% of the murders and other violent crimes.
This is not true. Black people do commit about 50% of the murders in this country, but not other violent crimes. For other violent crimes, the number is quite a bit lower, and even that only refers to arrests, not to incarcerations. Just a feel a need to clarify.
If you have 13% of the population,
that's another point that I would agree with completely. It's murder. It's not other violent crimes. The only other one that they are overrepresented would be like armed robbery or robbery. But in terms of like rape and assault and battery, it's not. So that's another fair point there. Let's continue.
responsible for 50% of the murders, and in some cities committing 2/3 of all violent crime. What percent of police attention should it attract? I honestly don't know.
Well, against which communities? Not all black communities are the communities that commit a ton of crime. Most of the black murder rate in this country is done in very specific communities where gangs that are mostly made up of black people fight other gangs, mostly made up of black people, for control over territory so they have turf upon which to sell their drugs. But let me ask you this. Let's imagine that we have, we don't need to imagine. The Italians, when they came into this country, the Italians brought crime with them. That's a fact. But a lot of the crime that Italians brought with them came from a very specific subset of the population that worked with an organized crime. So if you have a group of 1 million people, an ethnic minority in America, and of them, about 1,000 of them are a well-connected criminal syndicate that commits a massively disproportionate amount of crime, do you think it would be fair to justify unfair treatment against the entire ethnic group based on the behavior of that one syndicate? I would argue no. I would argue that it's a non-racialized element, frankly. And the reason why there are so many black gangs is because they were the ones forced into the ghettos where the only opportunity for economic success was drug running, and because the government in large part allowed the formation of drug cultures to run rampant in these communities before enacting the war on drugs and making it so severe a criminal offense, thus creating the perfect conditions for gang warfare. Is that a race thing? I mean, did race make that happen? Well, kind of, because black people were the ones who were redlined into those districts. But is that their fault? In another world, where it was instead the humble Irish who were cracked down on and shoved and redlined into these ghettos, they were the ones disproportionately policed, they were the ones forced into these inner cities?
Okay, let's stop it there. This is where the excuse making begins, and it is just an awful look. Look, obviously there are aspects of society that, like redlining and so forth and so on, that have created these environments that are less than optimal, let's say. And these environments obviously are going to cause some pretty bad knock-on effects. That's a given. But we can't excuse 50% murder rate from a number of cities. If he's saying it's select cities with predominantly black populations, that's true. But we can't. Again, this is it's a system. It's a cycle that has to be broken, but you're never going to break it by committing murders at this rate, by having gang warfare in your neighborhood. It's never going to happen. Okay, so there are aspects beyond their control that have put them in the situation they're in. But they're never going to make the situation better by acting the way they're acting in these certain cities and neighborhoods around the country. And Vaush seems to lay not enough blame on the individuals committing these crimes, and more so on the things that have been put in place in the past that cause them to be in these neighborhoods, in these situations. This is a common point of where you have to tell the individual something different than you tell the collective. So the individual themselves, they have to act better. They have to do better. And you have to tell them, like, listen, this is what you have to do. This is how you have to carry yourself. You have to do this. You have to do that. You can't do this. You can't do that. And if enough individuals then carry that stuff to fruition in real life, they will collectively fix the whole, while still understanding, if you're the person giving the advice, while still understanding that the system is dialed in such a way that it's making it harder for them 100%. There are certain things that have been done in the past and certain things that are still going on that make it more difficult for them to succeed. That's 100% accurate. But they are doubling down and making it 10 times more difficult for themselves to succeed by basically just buckling under the weight of the situation they're in.
They were the ones who were given access to these cartel drug runs. They would be the ones making up such a disproportionate amount of the murder rate in this country. Guaranteed. The humble Irish. It's true.
But I'm pretty
Again, what he says there, that may be true. It probably is true. But again, we can't just excuse the fact that these crimes are being committed. And what Sam says is, when he asks the question, what level of policing should you expect, is proportional. Well, yeah, you would, regardless of what the system is like or not like. If there is a neighborhood that has an above high murder rate than the rest of the surrounding neighborhoods in the state, you need to police that area higher than you do the other ones. It's just common sense. Now, we also need to do things behind the scenes, like end the drug war and, fix the sentencing problem with African Americans as opposed to other races. We need to fix the schooling in these neighborhoods. For sure, we need to do that, because that's what will really turn down the dial and begin to fix the problem. But that may take a generation. So in the meantime, you can't have neighborhoods where people are being killed and robbed and whatnot, and there's gang warfare on the streets, and not police them enough to have the law-abiding citizens feel safe where they live. Let's continue.
sure it's not just 13%. And given that the overwhelming majority of their victims are black, I'm pretty sure that most black people wouldn't set the dial at 13% either. And here we arrive somewhere near the core of the problem. The story of crime in America is overwhelmingly the story of black-on-black crime.
I mean, not really. If we're talking about low-level murder, today and only today, then yeah, in large part. If we're talking about historically, that is not the case at all. And even today, if we're taking a look at like crime that meaningfully affects our society, how many people died due to murder in 2018? How many people died due to an opioid overdose based on the irresponsible pushing of prescription drugs by doctors who are funded by our pharmaceutical industry? Opioid. My issue is, when we talk about crime rates, we're usually only talking about population over severity. Which is worse? The crime that happens today in America, the black crime rate, or the handful of lives it took for the United States to get embroiled in a war in Iraq?
Okay, now this is just a complete red herring. Just a complete red herring. The war in Iraq, he brings up the war in Iraq when we're talking about police brutality and crime in America and black crime. This is a complete red herring. This is just unbecoming of Vaush. And yeah, the story of crime right now is a story of a myriad of different crimes. That's where Sam is wrong in his statement, and Vaush basically states that and says, the story of crime, depending on when you're talking about it, is different things, and that's obvious. But bringing up the Iraq War, and obviously crimes were committed there as well, and lies were told there as well. But this is a complete red herring.
Which one of those shows up in the crime statistics? Which one of those do people talk about when they talk about harm done? We pay a lot of attention to low-level crime and the harm it does. But when we reduce discussions of criminality exclusively to those areas, we ignore that the greatest harms done to our society are usually done by people who never spend a day in a jail cell. And that is a fundamentally classist way of looking at crime, and it is a fundamentally racist way of looking at crime, because it implicitly gives credence to the most powerful in our society while continuing to trample on those who have next to no power, who have very little power, in fact.
This is just, it's I don't even know why he says what he says there. It's not fundamentally racist to pay more attention to murder rates in the states or cities that you live in or are adjacent to where you live. Not in the slightest. It's more visceral. You see it more on the headline news. You hear about it more. You may know somebody. It's scary. It's frightening because it's closer to you. So it's obvious that is going to be a hotter topic of debate and discussion among the rest of your fellow citizens, as opposed to the Iraq War and the politics behind that, because that takes a whole lot more understanding, and it takes a lot more reading into it to really know the facts and the minutia of that situation, as opposed to just hearing on the nightly news that so-and-so was murdered in a city 20 minutes north of you. That doesn't make it fundamentally racist.
In part, a story of black on white crime. But for more than a generation...
That's not really that common statistically.
It really has not been much of a story of white on black crime. Now,
I mean, that depends. Do you consider redlining to be a white on black crime? Do you consider police brutality to be a white on black crime? Do you consider the disproportionate arrest rate to be white on black crime?
Wait, no, I don't, man, I hope you don't too consider police brutality to be a crime of white on black crime. That is an asinine statement. No, I do not consider that a white on black crime. Let's continue.
Crime? Do you consider the disproportionate rate of sentencing to be white on black crime? Do you consider the implicit bias in the criminal justice system to be white on black crime? This is exactly what I mean.
No, I don't. And here's why. And Vaush doesn't either, because as he stated before, the things in the system that are causing the disparities between blacks and whites and Hispanics and so forth, the systematic racism is implicit. It actually doesn't take a bad actor being a racist to have these things affect people. He knows that. He said it before. So it's not a white on black crime, because it doesn't take an actual criminal to carry out or have the system work in the way that it's working.
The way our legal structure is set up right now is optimized to leave the greatest berth for condemnation possible with regards to the shit black people do. And then all the stuff done against black people systemically, that gets rolled into the legitimate functionality of the system. When them North Carolina legislators pass a bill that was struck down by the Supreme Court as being racist against black people with surgical precision, people go, oh, whatever. Okay, whatever. Maybe it was racist, maybe it wasn't. Just would have disenfranchised tens, hundreds of thousands of voters. Just whatever. Kept them from voicing their political opinions. Literally the thing we fought a revolutionary war over. But then you get some disproportionate rates of crime because in inner city environments, gangs are killing each other, and the police are doing everything criminologists and sociologists have been telling them not to do for 40 years. And people throw their hands up. Now, Sam Harris, for the most part so far, from this one very small segment of the podcast that I'm listening to, seems to be leading a lot with the questions that he is asking. He has brought up no sociological explanation. He's not really considered why these things may be. And I cannot help but remember the fact that Sam Harris has had Charles Murray, the hack author of The Bell Curve, who didn't even know what heritability was, onto his show before. So I am a little curious what his perceived explanation is. And I guess I'll give him a chance. Oh, yes, he defended Charles Murray as well. He didn't just have...
Okay, now here we have... He seems like he's just talking to himself here. He's not really discussing or talking about what Sam is saying. He's impugning things to him that he hasn't said in this segment that Vaush is reacting to. This is where I will agree with Vaush. Sam doesn't bring up in this podcast at all, not because I've listened to it myself. He doesn't bring up anything about why these situations are the way they are and how he thinks that they can be remedied. He doesn't do that. And that's, I don't know why he doesn't do that. He definitely had the time. Obviously, it's almost like 3 hour or 2 hour podcast, and he should have done that. And maybe he will in the future, but I'm not gonna, crucify him for it now based on something he omitted. It's just, I don't know if that's something he's going to do in the future at some point when he'll discuss why he thinks the way these things are, why the statistics fall the way they do, what he believes could be done to fix these issues.
Have him on. He defended Charles Murray and the Bell Curve, if I remember correctly.
The murder rate has come down steadily since the 1990s, with only minor upticks. But nationwide, blacks are 6 times more likely to get murdered than whites. And in some cities, their risk is double that. And around 95% of these murders are committed by members of the African American community.
Mm-hmm.
The weekend these protests and riots were kicking off nationwide, when our entire country seemed to be tearing itself apart over a perceived epidemic of racist police violence against the black community.
Now, don't strawman us. Police reform is a part of what people are protesting about. But Black Lives Matter has always been about a much broader challenge to the bias in our criminal justice system.
92 people were shot and 27 killed in Chicago alone, right? One city. This is almost entirely a story of black men killing members of their own community.
So this is the very classic misdirection conservatives tend to engage in when it comes to talking about systemic racism. You say it was a problem when such and such white police officer shot such and such black 12-year-old. But did you know 100 people died in Chicago last year? I rest my case, as they fold their arms atop one another. Well, there's a problem with that. Let me ask you guys something. When you commit sanctions against another country that leads them into starvation and degenerates...
Okay, let's stop it there. This is, again, more excuse-making. One, he talks about misdirections when he threw out the motherload of red herrings before when he started talking about the Iraq War. It's not so much as a misdirection because we're still on the same topic. We're talking about crime. We're talking about crimes committed by a certain demographic of people. And when someone states, a police officer kills somebody and then someone returns and says, oh, well, in Chicago there was 77 murders this week alone or something like that. It's whataboutery. So you bring up this one point of contention and then they switch over to a different one. But they are connected. They are relevant to each other because, again, they're both murders. They're both crimes. And it's the same topic of understanding why perhaps certain neighborhoods and cities are being policed more than others. And then you have the police more prevalent, so there's more chances for police brutality. And it is extremely important, obviously. You can't be having a city anywhere where there's, dozens and dozens of murders in a 2-week span. Okay? The conditions are the way they are. They're awful, and we need to turn the dial in certain directions to get these things remedied. But again, that's going to take a long time. It's not going to just happen tomorrow. It's going to take years. It may take decades. In the meantime, you can't have people killing each other in the streets And you can't have people like Vaush just overlooking it or making excuses for it.
Their society and their civic order. Who actually commits the crime amidst the population of the people who are being sanctioned?
This is insane. This is absolutely insane. So, oh man, he's trying to say that who is sanctioning? So, in a situation where you'd have like the U.S. government sanctioning like Iran, that's the U.S. government sanctioning Iran. What is he trying to say here by who is sanctioning these neighborhoods, these cities? Who is doing that? If he doesn't state here, I'm not sure. I'm not going to, put words in his mouth, but who would he even be referring to on who is sanctioning who? And then he says, who is actually committing the crime? Well, one, you'd have to point to me who was actually doing the sanctioning of these communities. And then two, I would say if you could point to me a certain entity or organization or person, they are culpable in some manner. But obviously, the people who are committing the murders are more culpable. They are the direct point of where the murder was committed. They are to blame for the murder.
Really think about it. If there's some small island country of 500,000 people, and we sanction them, we keep them from getting the food, the medical supplies they need, and then those people in that 500,000 population island nation, well, in the absence of social order caused by material abundance, people start to hurt one another. People start to hoard food and medical supplies. People fight over them. It's a historical reality that an absence of food and medicine very frequently leads to civil unrest in the communities that are being sanctioned. But who's actually doing the hurt? Now, if you just look at crime statistics, oh, well, who's hurting over there? Well, it's island nation resident hurting island nation resident. Murders and rapes and robberies being committed against island nation residents by island nation residents. But who's causing the hurt? It'd be us.
Oh, he's still beating his drum. It's obvious who is causing the hurt. Again, this is where he is making excuses and not putting the onus where it belongs, on the people committing the crimes. I've said this. I'm just getting tired of saying it. We know about the certain instances of where the system is tilted against these certain communities. We know that. We have to do what we have to do to fix that. We have to start to end the drug war. We have to do better when it comes to the whole application process. When everyone knows a study about, reading the names off the application, whether the name sounded more black or more white, they got to call back. We got to do better on sentencing, fairness. We have to fix the school situation in these neighborhoods. We have to fund the schools better. We got to clean up the neighborhoods in that aspect, give them more hope of an education. We know that. But in the meantime, all of that stuff is going to be 10 times harder if people are killing each other in these neighborhoods. And they need to be held accountable and removed from the neighborhoods if that's what they're doing. Because the neighborhood is never going to get to where it's going if these crimes are being committed, regardless of how much we're trying to fix the system behind the scenes. You're not going to get businesses to go in there and start up these, huge conglomerate corporations or even small businesses that want to go in there and in a city that has a much higher crime rate than another city that they can choose to start a business. The school is going to be much harder to fix. It's awful excuse making by Vaush. And that's where we'll end this one here. And then I will be releasing part 2 where I go over the rest of Vaush's reaction video to Sam Harris.